they're destroying my country. They're intentionally destroying my country. They're saying Vladimir Putin is an ally. They're taking down the federal bureaucracy. They're taking down the schools and universities to enrich the billionaire class. And then they're throwing scapegoats to the American people, to the working people, trans women, Black Americans. It's about juicing up dominant group victimhood. It's about telling white Americans, you're the real victims.
You just heard from Professor Jason Stanley of Yale University, who's the author of How Fascism Works. And I read this book myself back in 2018 during Donald Trump's first term, when I wanted to get a better understanding of fascism and really ground myself in the history of fascist movements and how they materialized. And this book really helped me to contextualize the threat of modern-day fascism and understand how this is not just occurring in a vacuum in the United States. It is an international phenomenon. And Professor Stanley has been sounding the alarm about the threat of fascism for a while now, not just because he's an expert, but because he is a Jewish man whose grandmother fled Germany back in 1939. And recently, as The Guardian reports, he announced that he himself is leaving his home in America because he warns that the United States is at risk of becoming a full-fledged fascist dictatorship. And as Nicole Hannah-Jones put it on Blue Sky, when scholars of authoritarianism and fascism leave U.S. universities because of the deteriorating political situation here, we should really worry. Yeah, that's a pretty good indication that things aren't going so well. Now, to be clear, he doesn't view this as him fleeing the country, and his decision to move was partially influenced by a position that he accepted at the University of Toronto, but he makes it very clear that he's not just moving because he's taking a new job, and his university, Yale, is trying to lay low so as to not attract the rage and wrath of Donald Trump. But he makes it clear he's also moving because he fears for the future for his children in this country, and he thinks that the capitulation to Trump by institutions, as well as the crackdown on universities by this administration, are extremely dangerous signs of what's to come. So without further ado, let's hear why he's choosing to get out now.
So you feel strongly enough about this that you are going to leave the country?
Yes, because I would not do this if I saw all of our universities banding together. But it's not just the universities, Michelle. It's the law firms. It's all of our American institutions. I'm leaving because the political climate for the universities and the political climate for freedom looks grim in this country. We face a fascist regime. I have two Black children, two Black Jewish children, and, the United States to erase, to use one of their identities as a sledgehammer for fascism and to try to erase another of their identities is deeply problematic for me. And, there's all these longstanding features of this country, like mass incarceration that I worry, and violent policing that obviously with two Black sons concern me as well. I do think that the institutions that I love are being existentially threatened, and they're not defending themselves in a way that gives me any kind of hope that free inquiry will still be possible.
So the fact that universities like Columbia are capitulating instead of fighting back and defending their students does not bode well. And we don't just see this in education. Media companies and pundits, as well as corporations and tech oligarchs, are all lining up to kiss Trump's ring. And this isn't a mere cultural shift. This is emboldening somebody who wants to be a tyrant. It's significant. There's a reason why in his book on tyranny, Timothy Snyder made it a priority to tell people to not obey in advance because, quote, most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. And in times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. And these corporations and universities are teaching Donald Trump that all he has to do is make a threat and they'll jump like that. All he has to do is ask how high, and that is exactly what we're seeing right now. And for those unaware who haven't read on tyranny, Chapter 2 necessitates that we defend institutions, and the fact that institutions have not bonded together to defend themselves has helped Donald Trump to consolidate all of his power, and it's put us on a direct path towards a fascist dictatorship, which is what Professor Stanley is warning us about right now. And the reason why he's hyper-focused on educational institutions isn't just because he's a professor, but because they are ground zero for fascism. And he alluded to that in that clip when he explained that his two kids are black and Jewish, and their Jewish identities are being used as a sledgehammer for fascism. Now, I think that it's really important to understand what he means by this, because he explains that it is dangerous for the Trump administration to crack down on universities under the pretense of protecting Jewish students, because destroying democracy in the name of protecting Jewish people is going to have long-term consequences. So I'll let him explain that.
What are the most toxic anti-Semitic tropes? Well, Jews control the institutions. This is absolutely reinforcing this. Any young American is going to think, remember what happened when they took down the world's greatest university system on behalf of Jewish safety? This will go down in history books. The history of this era will say that Jewish people were the sledgehammer for fascism. So if we don't speak out, if we American Jews do not speak out against this, this will be a grim history chapter in our history as Americans. It's the first time in my life as an American that I have been fearful of our status as equal Americans, not because of the protests on campus, which, as I said, had a lot of Jewish students in them, but because we are suddenly at the center of politics, of U.S. politics. It's never good to be in the crosshairs for us. And we are being used to destroy democracy. The history books are going to be harsh unless we Jewish Americans can say, this should not be done in our name. And finally, by focusing on us, they're erasing the atrocities and horrors that are happening in Gaza.
So he's concerned as a Jewish man that Trump's cynical weaponization of anti-Semitism is going to foster long-term anti-Semitism, because Trump is destroying universities and the First Amendment in the name of protecting Jewish students, which is bullshit. But he's doing this because it serves two important purposes. One, it makes it so that way their crackdown seems more altruistic. And two, it obscures the reason why students are protesting in the first place. He alluded to it. They were there because they didn't want their tuition dollars going towards a genocide. And as a Jewish man who supports Palestinian human rights himself, Professor Stanley goes on to explain how Trump is erasing all of the Jewish students who participated in those same protests in order to construct and maintain this false narrative that is being used to justify this crackdown. So in this next clip, he's going to respond to the claim that Jewish students felt unsafe at these universities. And here's what he says.
There were a tremendous number of Arab students who felt incredibly threatened at Columbia. What about them? They're people too, first. Secondly, at Yale, and I'm sure this was true of Columbia, there were a very large number of Jewish students in those protests, because who on campus cares the most about the behavior of Israel? Well, one group are Jewish students. But the way the administration is using the term anti-Semitism is synonymous with leftism, which is ironic because the large majority of Jewish Americans voted for Kamala Harris. And there were plenty of students. It was tied for the largest identity group in the protests. So why don't they count as Jewish?
They're using anti-Semitism as a synonym for leftism. That right there is a crucial point, because all throughout history, fascists have always targeted their biggest opponents, i.e. communists, i.e. socialists, labor unions, and leftists. And this conflation with leftism and criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism is nothing more than an excuse to go after the people that pose the biggest threat to his legitimacy. And the erasure of Jewish students who are pro-Palestinian in and of itself is anti-Semitic. And Professor Stanley goes on to explain how Trump is basically trying to dichotomize Jewishness into good and bad Jews, where your Jewishness is accepted only if you're a good Jew who supports Israel's genocide. But if you're one of the bad Jews who criticize Israel, then your Jewishness is rejected. I mean, Trump himself has attacked Jewish Americans who vote for Democrats again and again, and he called Doug Emhoff a crappy Jew and uses Palestinian as a slur when talking about Chuck Schumer, because Chuck Schumer once dared to call for Netanyahu to resign. Never mind the fact that Chuck Schumer is an enthusiastic supporter of Israel's genocide, but the mere fact that he dared to call for somebody new to conduct the genocide, perhaps in a more gentler way, was cause for Trump to unilaterally revoke his Jewishness and call him a Palestinian as if that's a bad thing. I mean, this is what Professor Stanley is talking about. Trump is cynically wielding anti-Semitism as a political sword against the left, and he's using it as a justification to violate people's First and Fifth Amendment rights. We already talked about Mahmoud Khalil, who was disappeared by the Trump administration for being one of Columbia's student negotiators, and the claim was that he made Jewish students feel unsafe. As one of the organizers, come to find out, Jewish students spoke out in his defense, saying actually he defended us from anti-Semitic hecklers. But then there's also Rumaysa Öztürk, a Turkish citizen on a student visa attending Tufts University, who was recently kidnapped by ICE agents wearing civilian clothing, who put her in an unmarked vehicle, much like Mahmoud Khalil, and we haven't heard from her since. Her student visa was revoked, and journalist Prem Thakur reports that she's been accused of engaging in activities in support of Hamas, i.e. she supports Palestinian human rights, and at the time that I record this, we still don't know where she is, and her attorney filed a request to force the government to produce her, presumably to confirm that she's even alive at this point, because we don't know what happened, and that request was granted by a judge. Now, whether or not the Trump administration will comply is a different story, but stories like this are why Professor Stanley puts so much emphasis on universities, because he believes that if they're doing this to non-citizens, it's only a matter of time until they do it to citizens. Universities, again, are ground zero for fascism. And Senator Chris Murphy is one of the few Democrats speaking up about the significance of these abductions. And he explains how the specific power that Trump is invoking to disappear students and send immigrants to a gulag in El Salvador is actually a real step towards martial law.
This should matter to every single American. Okay, first of all, the president doesn't need the Alien Enemies Act in order to remove from this country people who pose a threat to the nation, people who have engaged in criminal behavior or who have coordinated with terrorist groups. He has that power under existing law to remove from the country non-citizens. So he doesn't need this authority. What he is trying to do is put America on war footing. This is an act that has only been exercised 3 times in American history: during the War of 1812, during the First World War, and during the Second World War. It is a wartime authority. And what you really worry about is the president continuing to move forward in exercising wartime powers in order to suspend additional elements of the Constitution. He, of course, has shown affection for something called the Insurrection Act, which would put the military in charge of everyday law enforcement in this country. You are watching along multiple channels this massive slide away from democracy and democratic norms. And so that video is chilling because, A, the president doesn't need that act to be able to remove a threat, but B, it speaks to his willingness to try to put America in a kind of quasi-martial law that ultimately will come to be a threat not just to green card holders, but to American citizens as well. So it's a really worrying time.
And I think it makes sense to characterize this as quasi-martial law, where constitutional protections are suspended in service of fighting some threat to our sovereignty. And even though we're not at war, and it's bullshit to characterize it as such, him doing that, him speaking about this as an invasion and a war, is being done to lay the groundwork for the day when he eventually does declare martial law. I mean, him declaring gangs as terrorist organizations to justify strikes in Mexico, a sovereign country. I mean, when you look at all of this and step back, it's evident why he's doing all of these things. So, I mean, I think that whether or not Trump does declare actual martial law in the near future is probably going to hinge on whether or not he's able to bypass the courts that are currently trying to stop him from using the Alien Enemies Act to deny people of their constitutional rights. And martial law would be much worse, because then civil liberties, civil rights, constitutional protections are just shut down for everybody, citizens and non-citizens alike. Nobody gets due process. So that would be a very big escalation, which would allow him to consolidate power in a way that would irreversibly fuck the country. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but with the way that things are going and how he's laying the groundwork for that, it's worrying. In other words, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Having said that, though, I do believe that it will get better at some point. I don't know when, but Trumpism isn't going to last forever. Now, with that being said, it's important to note that Trump isn't an exception or an aberration. He is the logical conclusion to the Republican Party's long-term project. So it's possible that the Trump era extends beyond his term and beyond his life, and someone else might pick up the torch and extend this era of authoritarianism even longer. But one thing that we do know for certain is that this fascist era will one day come to an end, as this TikToker eloquently explained.
At some point, this is all going to end. We're going to reach a climactic state where the bubble is going to burst. There are going to be mass awakenings happening where MAGA is going to start coming out of its fugue state en masse. And when that happens, those people that I've heard from who said, you know, my dad or my mom or my aunt or my brother who used to be the nicest, most generous, most kindest person who's now this crazy MAGA, they're going to come back to who they once were. And they're going to have to reckon with all of the damage that they have caused. They're going to have to come to terms with what they contributed to, what they enabled, what they allowed to happen, what they helped to progress forward. And when that happens, the guilt and the shame that they are going to feel is going to be harrowing. And I don't know if they're prepared for that, because that's what happened to so many Germans after they realized what they had helped contribute to during the Holocaust. There were people who couldn't even live with themselves anymore, if you're catching my drift.
Yeah, and I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen at some point. The question is when, and more importantly, what comes after that? Because our country historically has committed atrocities and just moved on with no reconciliation whatsoever. I mean, to this day, the United States government has not recognized the genocide of indigenous people, nor have they paid the reparations that were promised to Black Americans for slavery and Jim Crow. But having said that, there have been times where we at least tried to right our wrongs. When Japanese Americans were put in internment camps during World War II, also under the Alien Enemies Act, by the way, they actually were given reparations. Ronald Reagan, of all presidents, was the one that signed that into law. So, I mean, when it's all said and done, the question is, are we going to provide justice to Trump's victims and the victims of fascism and make reforms to prevent this from ever happening again? Or are we just going to try to move on and paper over the mistakes like we've done before? Because if that happens, we're all but guaranteed to make the same mistakes once again. Because as the saying goes, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But I don't want to give you the impression that we've already lost the fight to fascism, because even Professor Stanley isn't that pessimistic. We're still in the transition phase between democracy and dictatorship, although we are clearly headed in one direction. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to learn from history and try to defend ourselves from fascism to the best that we can before it gets worse. Stop obeying in advance. Organize and educate yourself and others about our laws and the Constitution, and do what you can to condemn the violations of civil liberties that are taking place. If people know about this, then I do believe that they will stand up. I mean, if enough people see what's happening with Mahmoud Khalil and Öztürk, I think that we can make a difference. You just have to make sure people know, because they won't be outraged about the injustices that are taking place if they don't even know what's happening. They're ignorant to the gulag that we're sending a bunch of Venezuelan migrants to. because they have tattoos. And it's not like we're just screaming into the void, because we already proved that we can make a difference. During that federal freeze, Donald Trump backed down because there was so much pressure exerted on him. When the Medicaid funding portals were cut off temporarily, we can make a difference. So if we maintain that energy and shore up support for each other, we might actually have a fighting chance.